All right, everyone, settle in. Tonight, we begin with one of the most complex, disciplined, and majestic civilizations in world history, Imperial China. For over 2,000 years, it set standards in science, philosophy, warfare, art, and bureaucracy. But don't romanticize it too quickly, because as breathtaking as the Forbidden City might seem from afar, if you lived there, your life would have been anything but glamorous. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always genuinely fascinating to see our audience connecting from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's smoothly transition into tonight's journey together. Welcome to Imperial China, where the moment you exit the womb, society politely hands you a roll and then nails it shut. Think of the social system like a multi-tiered cake, except you're the stale bottom layer and the frosting never trickles down. At the very top sits the Emperor, also known as the Son of Heaven, which is a lovely title until you realize heaven doesn't take complaints. He rules by the mandate of heaven, meaning as long as the crops grow and rebellions stay quiet, his divine status remains unchallenged. If things go wrong, well, guess heaven changed its mind. Time for a new dynasty. Beneath him sit the scholar officials, men who spent most of their lives memorizing Confucian texts, quoting philosophy no one asked for, and developing hunched backs from a lifetime of bamboo scrolls and social superiority. They passed the imperial exams, which were essentially the SATs if failing meant dying poor forever. Next are the farmers. Yes, the muddy, sun-scorched, underfed backbone of society. Confucian doctrine actually respected them. They fed the empire, after all. Unfortunately, respect doesn't come with dental care or lunch breaks. Then come artisans, the people who meticulously made things with their hands: paper, porcelain, fans, frustration. Useful, absolutely. Respected, not so much. But hey, at least they weren't merchants. Merchants, richer than everyone, trusted by no one. According to Confucian values, making a profit off other people's labor was morally slippery, so you could be dripping in silk and silver, but still be treated like a tax-evading raccoon in a brocade robe. Then we reach the societal basement. Soldiers, servants, butchers, actors, and criminals. Basically anyone you wouldn't want to sit next to at a formal banquet. Oh, and monks, somewhere in a gray area between holy man and why are you bald and barefoot in public. And finally women, not even on the pyramid. They were more like the gravel surrounding it. Born to obey their fathers, handed off to obey their husbands, and expected to produce sons who could someday obey more men. So if you were born in Imperial China and hoped to follow your dreams, society had one answer. That's adorable, now get back to work. Your day in Imperial China starts bright and early, not because you're a morning person, but because the rooster is screaming and the village bell is clanging as if it's trying to summon the afterlife. You open your eyes, stretch your limbs, and then immediately remember you're not allowed to just exist. First, you bow. Not to some abstract deity or noble ideal, but to your dad, then your mom, then your grandpa, possibly to your great aunt if she's still breathing. This is filial piety, and it's not just encouraged, it's mandatory. Forget to bow, that's not just being rude, that's inviting cosmic shame onto 7 generations of your bloodline. And you don't just bow once, you bow in stages. You bow when you wake up. You bow before eating. You bow when someone older than you coughs in your direction. If you're not bowing at least 6 times before breakfast, are you even Chinese? Now say you accidentally speak out of turn during morning tea. Maybe you asked a question like, why do I have to wash uncle's feet? Well, congratulations. You've now committed unfilial behavior, which is one small notch above public arson in terms of social disgrace. You'd better start rehearsing your apology with 3 full kowtows and an optional forehead-to-floor touch. And yes, the furniture is judging you too. Most households didn't have chairs unless they were rich, so you're kneeling on woven mats, trying not to collapse while your elders launch into 45-minute monologues about respect, discipline, and how the world went downhill ever since the last dynasty. Let's not forget the Confucian hierarchy chart, the spiritual PowerPoint slide that dictates who gets to talk, sit, or breathe first. Age beats youth, men outrank women, fathers outrank everyone, Even among siblings, older ones can talk over you. If you're the youngest, just nod, smile, and hope you're not blamed for something someone else did. There is no good morning in Imperial China. There is only a series of respectful rituals and a quiet prayer that today you won't accidentally offend someone and get disowned. You've bowed approximately 47 times before 7 a. Congratulations, you've survived the opening ceremony of the day. Now it's time for breakfast, the most important meal of the day, to remind you that life is suffering. So what's on the menu? Let's see. A steaming bowl of rice gruel, also known as congee, which is a generous way of saying hot, wet nothing. It's made by boiling rice in water until the rice gives up and becomes soup. If you're lucky, it has a little salt. If you're really lucky, a stray sliver of pickled vegetable floats by like a rare koi. If your family is on the poorer end of the spectrum, and let's face it, you are, that bowl of congee is about as exciting as your social prospects. You eat it quietly, respectfully, and under the silent judgment of at least one grandparent who remembers when even gruel was a luxury. Meat, don't even ask. That's for festivals, weddings, and imperial officials who haven't visited a rice paddy since the Han Dynasty. Eggs are possible, but they're usually preserved in salt or ash until they resemble fossilized sadness. If someone brings out pork belly, you immediately check for visiting relatives or divine intervention. Tea is served, of course, not for relaxation, but because plain water is suspect. Tea, at least, has been boiled and thus statistically less likely to kill you. You sip it slowly, even though your stomach is still wondering when the meal actually started. Meanwhile, you eat in silence. Meals are not for chatter. You don't discuss dreams, goals, or how you cried last night thinking about the imperial exam. You eat facing the ancestral shrine, silently thankful for your ancestors, even if they left you a thatched roof, chronic anemia, and impossible family expectations. The bowls are rough ceramic. The spoons are made of wood. There is no napkin. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve if it's clean enough, and get ready to start working off the meal you barely consumed. And as you rise, your father nods once. Eat quickly. Heaven favors the diligent, which roughly translates to, get back to work. We've got dynasties to maintain. You've finished your bowl of existential porridge, and now it's time to get dressed. Not to impress, but to not get fined, flogged, or mistaken for a social class above your station. Because in Imperial China, what you wear isn't about self-expression, it's about survival. Let's start with fabric hierarchy. Are you a farmer? Hemp. Coarse, itchy, scratchy hemp, the medieval equivalent of wearing a potato sack dipped in disappointment. Are you a noble? Silk. Glorious, shimmering silk that flows like poetry and whispers, tax the peasants more. And guess what? If you're caught wearing the wrong fabric, you're not just unfashionable, you're committing a crime. Clothing wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was law. The government had detailed regulations on sleeve width, hat shape, belt ornaments, and even color. Yellow, for instance, was reserved exclusively for the emperor. Wear yellow as a commoner, and you're not starting a fashion trend, you're starting your own execution. Let's talk footwear. Cloth shoes for peasants, embroidered silk slippers for the elite. Practicality? Optional. Comfort? Unlikely. You didn't dress for the weather, you dressed for the dynasty. And now the feet. Specifically, foot binding. The aesthetic equivalent of turning your toes into a curled-up secret. If you were a high-born girl, your feet were broken, folded under, and bound tightly from the age of 5. Why? Because tiny deformed feet, called lotus feet, were considered beautiful. A woman's worth was literally measured by how effectively she could hobble across a room without falling. It wasn't just painful, it was permanent. Foot binding crippled generations of women, turning walking into an act of art and agony. But don't worry, at least you got to wear embroidered shoes no one ever saw, because walking far wasn't really an option anymore. Even men didn't escape wardrobe misery. Bureaucrats wore heavy layered robes year-round, even in summer, because status always outranked sweat. Some outfits even had winged hat flaps designed to keep officials from whispering to each other during court. So yes, Imperial Chinese fashion was elegant, symbolic, and deeply political, but it also chafed, pinched, overheated, or outright shattered your bones. Beauty is pain, they say, but here pain was mandatory, and beauty was a government-approved dress code. You're now properly dressed in your socially acceptable potato fiber tunic. Great. Time to head out and earn your daily calories, assuming the land, weather, and taxes allow it. Let's be honest, in Imperial China, work wasn't a calling. It was a never-ending endurance test, designed by Confucius and enforced by people who've never touched a shovel in their lives. If you're a farmer, and statistically you'll spend your entire life bent over a rice paddy. Not in a poetic, cinematic way, no. This is literal, back-breaking labor. You wake up before the sun, plant seedlings knee-deep in muck, swat away mosquitoes the size of small birds, and pray the landlord doesn't increase your grain tax again this year. Rain? You work. Drought? You work harder. Locusts? Work and scream at the sky simultaneously. The tools are basic. A wooden plow if you're lucky, your bare hands if you're not. Your ox is your best friend and your retirement plan. Lose him, and it's just you versus 10 acres of disappointment. Now let's say you're a woman. Your workload has a sequel. You'll help in the fields and cook, clean, spin thread, weave fabric, raise children, and somehow still be blamed when dinner is late or your husband sneezes wrong. Rest? That's something noble ladies do while debating poetry. Artisans don't have it much better. You spend hours making pottery, paper, or tools by hand, then sell them for barely enough to buy stale tofu. And merchants, technically richer but socially shamed, you could buy half the village and still be treated like a walking moral failure. Then there's corvée labor, government-mandated service. One day, the emperor may need a new road, canal, or tomb. Guess who's helping build it for free with a smile and no shoes? You. Refuse, and you're branded a criminal, or worse, a rebel. And at the end of it all, you trudge home, covered in dirt, to a bowl of thin porridge and the quiet satisfaction of not dying today. In Imperial China, work doesn't set you free. It just keeps you too tired to rebel. Ah, the imperial exam system. The grand gateway to upward mobility, or as it's more accurately known, the eternal written torture chamber of China. If you were a man born with a sliver of ambition and a family slightly wealthier than dirt, your life path was clear. Pass the civil service exam. Succeed, and you'd become an official, respected, powerful, with silk robes and actual chairs to sit on. Fail? Back to the rice fields, peasant. Simple? Not even close. These exams were less multiple choice and more memorize the entire Confucian canon word for word and write poetic essays that would make a 1,000-year-old ghost weep. Imagine being judged not just on grammar and meaning, but on whether your handwriting flows like a morally upright river. One smudge, one character out of place, one metaphor too edgy, instant failure. Studying began in early childhood and didn't stop until your hairline did. Boys crammed inside freezing study huts or boiled themselves alive in summer, scribbling out essays until their fingers curled permanently into brush-holding claws. Tutors drilled doctrine into your skull like academic blacksmiths. Your social life? Gone. Your hobbies? Confucius. Your dreams? Still Confucius. The top exam, the Jinshi, was held in the capital. You were locked in a cubicle the size of a coffin with nothing but paper, ink, and soul-crushing anxiety. You brought your own food, blanket, and chamber pot. Some examinees fainted. Others went mad. A few died. Yes, literally died from the pressure, and they weren't even given partial credit. Even if you passed the first round, more exams awaited. District, provincial, national. Years could go by. Decades. Some men tested into their 60s. One guy reportedly took the exam more than 40 times. That's not determination. That's trauma with a calligraphy pen. And if you failed, social shame. Your family, who sacrificed everything for your education, would be disappointed, and loudly so. Your neighbors would whisper. Your mother might cry. Your father might give you the look. You know, the one, "Why weren't you born smarter?" stare. So yes, the exam could lift you to greatness or break your mind, your body, and your lineage, all for the chance to be overworked, underpaid, and micromanaged by palace eunuchs. Worth it? That's up to Confucius. Feeling dirty yet? Don't worry, you will, because in Imperial China, personal hygiene wasn't so much a lifestyle as it was a seasonal suggestion. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. It happens sometimes, maybe once every few weeks if you were lucky and not freezing to death. In summer, sure, a dip in the river. In winter, you might go a month without a proper wash. And no, there was no lavender-scented soap. Soap, when used, was made from animal fat and ashes, a gritty blend that felt like exfoliating with misery. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in larger cities, but privacy wasn't really a thing. You'd be scrubbing your armpits next to an elderly merchant and a shrieking toddler while a monk recited hygiene proverbs in the corner. Refreshing. Toothpaste? Try salt, charcoal, or powdered bones. Toothbrushes were made from animal hair tied to bamboo, effective only if your goal was to mildly disturb your plaque into relocating. Dental hygiene wasn't great, which is probably why most older adults smiled like haunted jack-o'-lanterns. And then there were the parasites. Lice, fleas, bed bugs. These were less pests and more roommates. It didn't matter how rich you were. If you had hair, you had company. Comb shops flourished because everyone needed a lice comb, and if you didn't, you scratched your scalp like you were trying to summon lightning. Clothing wasn't helping. You wore the same outfit for weeks. Washing clothes required hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing by hand, and praying your shirt didn't disintegrate into fibers. Underwear existed but wasn't a daily requirement, especially for peasants, who often wore none at all. Risky business. And don't forget the toilets, or actually do for your own sake. A toilet was typically a hole in the ground, occasionally surrounded by wooden boards if you were fancy. Public latrines? Functional in the same way a haunted well is functional. Smelly, crowded, and always one step away from biological disaster. Imperial China had silk, philosophy, poetry, and palaces. But if you wanted a long, hot, private shower, you were about 1,500 years too early. So you've survived the lice, the breakfast disappointment, and the soul-crushing exam prep. But before you even think about complaining to your neighbor, remember, in Imperial China, the law is always watching. And unlike modern surveillance, this one comes with bamboo sticks and very creative punishments. Let's begin with the legal code. Imperial dynasties, particularly during the Tang and Qing periods, were known for having exhaustively detailed laws. There were laws about taxes, hairstyles, hat shapes, how to grieve properly, and how long you were allowed to mourn your in-laws. Accidentally wear the wrong color on the wrong festival day? Technically criminal. And yes, they kept receipts, official bamboo strip records, inked and filed by overworked scribes who probably hated their job. Punishment wasn't subtle. Forget modern courtrooms and community service. Imperial justice believed in education through suffering. For minor offenses, you might get flogged with a bamboo rod. Fun fact, the court even had different sizes of sticks depending on the crime. Light insult? Small stick. Stole a chicken? Bigger stick. Failed to bow deeply enough to a magistrate's horse? Surprise stick combo. For more serious crimes, things escalated quickly. You could be branded, tattooed on the face with your crime, sent into exile, or if you really upset someone important, executed in public slowly. Torture wasn't an exception, it was procedure. If you were accused of something, the court would often help encourage your confession with thumb screws, kneeling on spiked boards, or long hours in a stress position while being shouted at by a man with a scroll and no sense of humor. And here's the best part. You didn't even have to be guilty, just suspicious, inconvenient, or politically unlucky. Even your family could be held accountable. The law loved collective punishment. If your cousin said something seditious during a rice wine binge, you might wake up to find your house under investigation, because guilt apparently was hereditary. The law was structured, it was advanced, it was terrifying. Justice in Imperial China was less about fairness and more about obedience. The message was clear: behave, respect the order, and whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the magistrate's concubine. Welcome to the Imperial justice system's favorite hobby, torture. Not as a punishment, but as a handy pre-trial icebreaker. Let's say someone accuses you of stealing a chicken, disrespecting your father, or heaven forbid, expressing a controversial opinion about the emperor's poetry. The magistrate doesn't start by asking for your side of the story. No. This is Imperial China. You start by getting tied to a bench while they bring out the confession toolkit. First up, the bamboo rod, used for beating your back, buttocks, or thighs until you're sorry for crimes you may not even understand. It wasn't random violence. They kept official punishment logs, counting every stroke with bureaucratic precision. 30 lashes for theft, 45 for lying, 1 bonus lash for squirming. Still denying guilt? Time to upgrade. Kneeling on spiked boards was a classic. You kneel on rough wood embedded with stones or glass until your legs give out or your will does. It's a little like yoga if yoga were invented by angry civil servants. Then there's the finger crusher, 2 slabs of wood tightened with rope around your fingers. Fun fact, it was called the small tiger bench, which sounds adorable until your bones snap like kindling. It's hard to write a confession with broken fingers, but they didn't really care about penmanship. And yes, this was standard procedure. Torture wasn't seen as morally questionable. It was simply the most efficient way to get the truth, or at least a version of it that matched the official narrative. If you still wouldn't confess, they'd just escalate. Some punishments involved being stretched, whipped, or left tied up in the summer sun while officials took a lunch break. And don't bother screaming, the neighbors are used to it. Now, imagine you're innocent. Congratulations, you still get tortured because a clean confession was needed for proper record keeping. Better to admit to something than risk being labeled uncooperative. Imperial logic at its finest. So next time you complain about modern bureaucracy, remember, at least the DMV doesn't beat you with bamboo until you admit you might have parked improperly in 1372. You may think you're alone, but in Imperial China, someone is always watching. And no, it's not just your judgmental grandmother. The surveillance state wasn't digital. It was human, carefully trained, state-approved, and terrifyingly thorough. It began at the village level, where every town had a local baojia, or village elder, who wasn't just there to hand out rice. He was also your friendly neighborhood informant. Your neighbors? Also spies. Your extended family? Absolutely spies. Your servant who claims to be illiterate and deaf? Definitely a spy. People were incentivized to report suspicious behavior, and suspicious could mean anything from hoarding too much grain to coughing during a tribute speech. Even staying too quiet could raise eyebrows. What are you hiding, citizen? In the cities, you had a sophisticated network of yamen runners, scribes, and magistrate assistants, whose job was to investigate crimes, deliver messages, and casually observe everything you did. Every dynasty had its own version of this machine, but the goal remained the same: keep the peace by peeking through every available crack. Especially fond of surveillance were the eunuchs in the imperial palace, those castrated palace servants who couldn't father children, but absolutely could start coups. Many controlled their own secret police forces, operated spy rings, and whispered in the ears of emperors. Some eunuchs wielded more power than ministers, simply by knowing who said what to whom and when. And don't even try complaining about the system. Criticizing the emperor, even indirectly, like saying the sun looks a little tired today, could be interpreted as slander. Poets learned to master the art of subtlety. Everyone else just mastered the art of shutting up. What's worse, the government often published lists of executed criminals as a warning, complete with names and crimes. It was like an ancient Facebook feed, but with more beheadings. So if you had a rebellious thought, you kept it to yourself. If you had a rebellious cousin, you turned him in. And if someone smiled too wide while asking about your political opinions, that was your cue to fake a cough and run. Because in Imperial China, the walls had ears, and so did the trees, the neighbors, and probably your rice bowl. In Imperial China, marriage was not about falling in love under cherry blossoms. It was about duty, negotiation, and dowries so heavy they could break your ox cart's axle. Love? That was for poems, not people. Let's start with the basics. Marriages were arranged, always. Parents decided your fate while you were still learning how to hold chopsticks. If your family had status, they'd hire a matchmaker, a professional snoop who compared horoscopes, family records, and whether your future spouse's ancestors had ever done anything embarrassing 5 dynasties ago. If everything aligned, congratulations, you're engaged to someone you've probably never met. Physical attraction, personality, shared interests? Irrelevant. Compatibility was measured in birth charts and tax records. For women, marriage wasn't an exciting new chapter. It was a polite kidnapping with ceremonial robes. You left your family forever, changed your surname, and moved into your husband's home, where you were now expected to serve not only him, but his parents, his grandparents, and whatever cranky uncle happened to be living in the guest room. The dowry system meant your family had to send money, goods, or land with you. The more the better. Think of it as ancient China's version of, "Thanks for taking her off our hands." In return, the groom's family might give betrothal gifts, but don't get too excited. Sometimes that meant silks and jewelry. other times a slightly nicer chicken. Once married, your job was clear: produce male heirs, obey your in-laws, and never ever talk back. A wife was expected to be modest, silent, and hardworking, the holy trinity of Confucian womanhood. If you were too loud, too opinionated, or, heaven forbid, barren, you might get replaced legally with a concubine. Speaking of which, yes, concubinage was a thing. Men could take multiple concubines, especially if they were rich. Women, one man, one shot at survival. Divorce, rare, social suicide. The only acceptable grounds were 7 outs, including jealousy, disease, or excessive gossip. So if your tea-drinking habits annoyed your husband enough, he could legally dump you. Nice. In short, marriage in Imperial China was less happily ever after and more try not to get exiled for serving cold noodles. So you're thinking of rebelling? Maybe you're tired of backbreaking labor, endless bowing, or that smug magistrate who taxed your rice and your dignity in the same afternoon. Bold move. Unfortunately, in Imperial China, rebellion didn't make you a hero. It made you a very short-lived headline. Let's start with the fantasy. You gather a ragtag band of peasants, burn your landlord's tax ledgers, and proclaim a glorious new era of justice. The problem? The imperial army arrives 3 days later with horses, crossbows, and no sense of humor. You see, the emperors weren't just bureaucrats in gold hats. They were obsessed with stability. Confucian ideology taught that rebellion meant disorder, and disorder meant the universe was out of whack. That made you not just a criminal, but a cosmic threat. And the punishment for cosmic threats? Dramatic. You'd be captured, paraded, tortured, and often executed in a way specifically designed to discourage creative thinking. Public beheadings were popular, so was quartering. One emperor preferred slow slicing, a charming method where you were cut repeatedly until your paperwork and your torso were complete. And it didn't stop with you. The imperial government loved a good collective punishment. Your family, your neighbors, even that one guy who once lent you a hoe, they were all fair game. The logic was simple. If we erase your entire village, no one will rebel again. Effective, terrifying. Still, rebellions did happen. From the Yellow Turban Rebellion to the White Lotus Uprising, desperate people occasionally rose up, and while some sparked chaos, most were brutally crushed. The survivors were either enslaved, silenced, or drafted into public works projects they wouldn't survive long enough to finish. Even talking about rebellion was dangerous. Writing a sassy poem that hinted at discontent? Boom. Arrested. Confess under bamboo interrogation. If you're lucky, you get exiled to the outer provinces to think about your actions somewhere cold, rocky, and strategically flea-infested. So yes, rebellion sounded romantic, the stuff of dramas and legends, but in reality, you were more likely to become a cautionary tale carved onto a public plaque. Want to change the system? Best to keep your head down, literally. So maybe you thought, if I can't make it as a peasant, maybe I'll rise through the ranks, ace the exams, and live a comfortable life as a government official. Adorable. Welcome to court life in Imperial China, where yes, the tea is hot, the robes are silk, and the palace floors are polished to a divine shine, but so are the knives hiding behind everyone's backs. Let's begin with the Forbidden City, the emperor's heavily guarded wonderland. Inside, everyone is smiling and plotting. Eunuchs, ministers, concubines, scholar officials, all locked in a constant game of polite treachery. The only thing more cutthroat than court life was actual throat cutting, which also happened a lot. If you were an official, your every move was watched, not just by spies, but by rivals waiting for you to mess up. File a report with the wrong character? Treason. Mispronounce the emperor's name during a reading? Treason. Hesitate before kneeling? Treason adjacent, at the very least. And let's talk about eunuchs, castrated palace servants who wielded disproportionate power. Many started humbly, rose swiftly, and became gatekeepers to the emperor's inner world. Upset a eunuch? You might find your promotion mysteriously delayed or your name added to a secret accidental disappearance list. Meanwhile, the imperial harem wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a high-stakes political battlefield. Concubines vied for favor, sabotaged rivals, and hoped to birth a prince, preferably one who didn't get poisoned before age 5. The empress might technically be in charge, but good luck controlling 30 jealous women with nothing to do but scheme creatively. Even poetry was risky. Compose the wrong metaphor about wilting flowers or a crumbling wall, and someone might decide you're criticizing the emperor. There were officials executed for writing poems about the weather because the emperor took the hint. And when the emperor died, oh, now the real fun began. Succession disputes, secret wills, mysterious deaths, unfortunate illnesses. Half the court usually didn't survive the transition. So no, court life wasn't safer. It was just death in a silk wrapper. Your robe might be red, but so was the floor beneath it. You've made it this far. Bowed, bled, memorized 400 Confucian sayings, and dodged at least 3 types of death. But here's the grand truth about life in Imperial China. You were a statistic, a head count, a line item on a dusty tax ledger. To the empire, you were not a person with hopes and dreams. You were a grain of rice, small, anonymous, easily crushed, and ideally harvested for labor or revenue. The state didn't care if you had ambition, talent, or inner beauty. It cared if your family paid its taxes on time and produced able-bodied sons to draft into the next border defense project. From the emperor's viewpoint, you were one speck among hundreds of millions, and not even a glamorous speck. You weren't the golden imperial seal or a sacred relic. You were a moving part in a rice-producing, silk-spinning, canal-digging machine built to sustain dynastic continuity. Your birth was recorded not for celebration, but for future tax extraction. Your death was noted mostly so your family wouldn't keep trying to claim your rations. And in between, your life's purpose was to not cause problems, stay in line, fulfill your role, and try not to starve during a drought. Individualism? Cute idea. It didn't exist. You didn't follow your passion. You followed your father, your master, or your assigned bureaucratic rank. The idea of being unique, of standing out, was as threatening to the state as a crop blight or a Mongol invasion. Harmony was everything. Even your emotions were expected to be in line with your social status. Feeling sad as a peasant? Acceptable. Feeling inspired? Sit down. The census didn't ask what your favorite poem was. It asked if your roof leaked and whether you owned a pig. Even your body belonged to the system. Drafted for public works, you might be sent to build a canal you'd never benefit from or guard a wall you'd never see finished. Die along the way? No problem. There were always more grains where you came from. In Imperial China, you mattered, but only as long as you could be counted, taxed, or buried quietly. So here we are, 15 chapters deep, and if you've been paying attention, one thing is clear. Imperial China was magnificent and magnificently merciless. Yes, this civilization gave the world some of its most profound inventions. Gunpowder, paper, the compass, printing, bureaucracy that actually worked, mostly. The Great Wall snaked across mountains. The Forbidden City stood like a jewel of imperial will. And poetry flowed like the Yellow River, beautiful, endless, and often fatal if interpreted incorrectly. The legacy? Unmatched. The reality? Backbreaking, hierarchical, and constantly one bad rice harvest away from collapse. For every elegant brushstroke recorded in a scholar's diary, there were 10,000 peasants ankle-deep in mud, wondering whether this year's tax grain would leave anything left to eat. For every emperor buried beneath a mountain of jade and gold, there were hundreds of laborers buried beneath the same mountain because they were inconvenient witnesses. The brilliance of Imperial China didn't come cheap. It was paid for in childhoods lost to exam study, backs spent from fieldwork, and lives cut short by law, famine, or conscription. The system worked brilliantly for the top few. For everyone else, it worked them until they collapsed. And the worst part? Most of them accepted it, not because they loved oppression, but because the system had convinced them it was the natural order of things, that heaven had appointed their emperor, that filial piety, obedience, and silence were virtues, that suffering quietly was a form of virtue. That legacy, the duality of splendor and suffering, is what still echoes today. When people look back at Imperial China, they often see the calligraphy, the architecture, the philosophical quotes carved into stone. They don't always see the concubine poisoned in the harem, the starving mother selling her comb for rice, or the scholar who failed the exam for the 7th time and simply disappeared. So no, you wouldn't last a day in Imperial China, not because you're soft, but because that world wasn't built for survival. It was built for endurance, tradition, and control. And yet through it all, the empire endured, the people endured, but only a few of their stories were ever truly told. In the spring of 1846, the great westward migration was in full swing. The Oregon Trail pulsed with life, oxen trudging, wagon wheels creaking, and families dreaming of new beginnings. Among these travelers was a group of roughly 30 people led by brothers George and Jacob Donner and businessman James F. Reed. They weren't fortune seekers or adventurers. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and children chasing the promise of California's fertile valleys. Their timing seemed perfect. The snows wouldn't fall for months, and the well-worn path west had carried thousands before them. But the Donner Party, later numbering 87 people, made one critical error that would set them on a path toward tragedy. They chose to take a shortcut. This so-called shortcut was the Hastings Cutoff, an untested route promoted by Lansford Hastings, an opportunist who had never even traveled it himself with a wagon. It promised to shave weeks off the journey by cutting through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had sent guides ahead to leave letters encouraging immigrants to take his new route. The Donner Party, trusting those letters, left the traditional trail and followed his suggestion. At first, spirits remained high. The group included children, elderly parents, and entire families who sang hymns at night and held tight to hope. But trouble began quickly. The Wasatch Mountains were far more treacherous than Hastings claimed. The wagons had to be dismantled, hauled piece by piece, and reassembled. Progress slowed to a crawl. Tempers flared, supplies dwindled. Then came the desert. The Great Salt Lake Desert was a brutal, shimmering hell. Hastings had said it would take 2 days to cross. It took 5. Water barrels ran dry, animals collapsed, oxen went mad, entire wagons were abandoned in the alkaline dust. They had already lost precious time and winter was no longer far behind them. By the time they rejoined the main trail, they had lost weeks. Other wagon trains were already over the Sierra Nevada. The Donner Party, exhausted and behind schedule, pushed onward, unaware that the most harrowing part of their journey still lay ahead. The dream of California was still in their minds, but the mountains didn't care about dreams, and soon, neither would starvation. By late October 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was supposed to be the last great obstacle before descending into California's promised lands. But the mountains weren't just high, they were merciless, and winter was arriving early. The party was now fractured. Some families had forged ahead, while others, including the Donners and the Reeds, lagged behind, slowed by broken wagons, injured oxen, and sheer exhaustion. Snow began to fall, light at first, then relentless. Within days, the passes became impossible. They were trapped. They camped at Truckee Lake, what's now called Donner Lake, and others stopped further back at Alder Creek. Makeshift cabins were built from pine logs and wagon parts. They slaughtered their remaining animals. Hides were turned into crude tents. The snow kept falling, over 6 feet, then 10. The hunger came quickly. Rations were reduced. The livestock was gone. They boiled strips of rawhide and gnawed on leather belts. One child tried to eat a blanket. Another chewed on a piece of bark until their gums bled. Every morning brought another cold body. Death moved slowly, politely, then cruelly. Inside those cabins there was no warmth, just smoke, hunger, and silence. Mothers tried to comfort starving children. Fathers stared out into the endless snow, calculating how far they might get on foot. Arguments broke out. Hope thinned like the mountain air. On November 12th, a blizzard sealed their fate. Snow piled up to the roofs. Trees snapped under the weight. Any thought of escape was buried under white silence. The pass was closed, and the dream of California was gone, replaced by a desperate, singular thought: survival. By mid-December, with no rescue in sight, 15 of the strongest members formed what would be called the Forlorn Hope Party. 10 men and 5 women strapped crude snowshoes to their feet and attempted to cross the mountains on foot, carrying meager rations and the unbearable burden of what might come next. Behind them, dozens remained at camp, starving, dying, and waiting in a frozen purgatory. And for the Forlorn Hope, the question wasn't if they would survive, it was who would die first and who would eat them. On December 16th, 1846, 15 desperate souls stepped into the snow and vanished into history. They were dubbed the Forlorn Hope not by the newspapers, but by their fellow immigrants who watched them go, knowing full well what the word forlorn meant: lost, hopeless, doomed. Each member carried only what they could: scraps of dried oxhide, flint, a rifle, and shredded blankets. They built crude snowshoes, hoping to stay above the deep drifts, but it barely worked. The snow was powdery and endless. They slogged for miles each day, slowed by exhaustion and the icy grip of high-altitude wilderness. Within days, they were lost. The food ran out almost immediately. They had miscalculated the distance. A squirrel was caught, a pine cone boiled, and then a man collapsed. Franklin Graves, the oldest in the group. His daughters sobbed as he died in the snow. There was nothing they could do. And then, one by one, others began to fall. Antonio, the Mexican teamster, Patrick Dolan, raving and delirious, Lemuel Murphy, just 13. Death came not as a storm, but as a slow hush. It was silent, white, inescapable. Then came the moment. The line crossed in desperation and cold logic. The survivors carved meat from their fallen companions. They wept, prayed, vomited, and ate again. It wasn't savagery, it was calculus. Starve or live. Sarah Graves, just 19, later recalled the first taste. She never spoke of it again. William Foster, gaunt and silent, kept his thoughts to himself. Mary Ann Graves held her sister's hand and whispered that it didn't matter what they had to do so long as they got home. By the time they stumbled out of the mountains weeks later, only 7 had survived. 5 women and 2 men. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks frostbitten, their mouths silent. But they brought something far more powerful than supplies or maps. They brought news. There were dozens still alive, trapped at Donner Lake, starving, freezing, waiting, and they needed help. Now. California, which had largely ignored the Donner mess, suddenly woke up. The horror was too great, the shame too large. Rescue parties were organized, but by the time they arrived, the snow had grown even deeper. And in the cabins by the lake, what they would find was beyond imagining. The first rescue party arrived at Donner Lake in February 1847, 2 months after the forlorn hope emerged from the mountains. What they found wasn't a camp, it was a graveyard. Cabins were half buried in snow, doors frozen shut. Inside, people sat motionless, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed over from starvation. Frozen bodies were stacked like firewood, and the smell, thick, sickly, unforgettable, spoke of what had happened when the meat ran out. Some tried to speak, others simply stared. Of the 87 who had started the journey, nearly half were dead, and those still breathing were barely human anymore. Gaunt, skeletal figures wrapped in filthy hides, whispering prayers to an indifferent sky. The rescuers had brought supplies, flour, dried meat, blankets, but not enough to save everyone. There was no way to carry dozens through snowdrifts taller than wagons. They had to make impossible decisions. Children were chosen first, the smallest, the lightest, those with the greatest chance of surviving the trek back down the mountains. Parents stayed behind, watching silently as strangers carried away their children, unsure if they'd ever see them again. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue missions followed. Each had to battle whiteouts, avalanches, and terrain that had swallowed the Donner Party whole. With every return trip, the rescuers brought fewer supplies and found fewer survivors and darker stories. The truth began to leak out, not just of starvation, but of cannibalism, of how, in the worst nights, when all was lost, some survivors had fed on the dead. Some even whispered that others had killed to feed. The names were kept quiet, the rumors louder than the facts. Some were judged, others pitied. Most were simply too traumatized to speak. James Reed, who had been banished early in the journey for killing a man in self-defense, returned as a rescuer. Against all odds, he found his wife and children still alive. George Donner, however, lay dying at Alder Creek, his arm gangrenous. His wife, Tamsin, refused to leave him. She stayed behind when the others left and never made it out. When the final survivors reached California in April 1847, the ordeal was over, but the scars, emotional, cultural, and historical, were just beginning to form. News of the Donner Party's ordeal spread east like wildfire, twisting with each retelling, growing darker, more grotesque. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it. America, gripped by manifest destiny fever, was suddenly staring at its shadow. The story was too irresistible. Pioneers chasing paradise turned cannibals in the snow. Some headlines called it the cannibal horror of the Sierra, others accused survivors of murder. It wasn't just scandal, it was a national reckoning. The westward expansion had always been sold as glorious, godly, and inevitable, but now it was stained with the image of starving settlers roasting human flesh over pinewood fires. Journalists fixated on every ghastly detail: who ate whom, who died nobly, and who took too long to die. Sarah Graves, one of the survivors, was hounded for interviews. So was Mary Murphy, who lost almost her entire family. Survivors were caught between fame and shame, praised for surviving, yet judged for how they did it. James Reed, once a disgraced exile, returned to San Jose a changed man, haunted but vindicated. His leadership during the rescue missions earned him public sympathy, and he spent much of his later life trying to protect the reputations of the survivors. But even he couldn't silence the whispers. Tamsin Donner became a tragic symbol, a devoted wife who stayed behind with her dying husband, refusing rescue more than once. When she finally tried to leave with a group of men, she never made it. Her fate was murky. Some said she died of cold, others suggested she had been killed and eaten by the very men she trusted. The government, for its part, said little. California was on the brink of becoming U.S. territory, and the last thing officials wanted was to tarnish the dream of westward expansion. The incident was brushed aside as an unfortunate tragedy, an anomaly, no inquiry, no formal investigation. And yet, in every parlor and saloon, people talked about the Donners. The name itself became a cautionary tale. Children were warned, don't take shortcuts, don't stray from the trail, or you might end up like them. But beneath the horror, something more complex lingered. Questions about survival, morality, and just how thin the veneer of civilization really is when the snow won't stop falling. For those who lived through the Sierra Nightmare, the journey didn't end when the snow melted. Survival came at a price, etched into bone and memory. The survivors emerged from the mountains, but they never truly left them behind. Many were children. They returned to civilization as walking ghosts, quiet, underfed, wide-eyed. Some, like Virginia Reed, just 13 at the time, would go on to live long lives. She eventually married, had children, and even published letters recounting her ordeal. But beneath her composed surface lay trauma that pulsed like an old wound. Others fared worse. Mary Murphy, after losing her entire family, married young and died within a few years. Louis Kesselberg, a German immigrant who had been among the last rescued, was branded forever by rumors that he had not only consumed the dead, but murdered them to do so. He sued a newspaper for libel and won $1 in damages. It didn't matter. The stain never left him. Some survivors tried to disappear. They changed their names, moved far from California, or refused to speak about what happened. Others couldn't stop talking, haunted not just by what they'd done, but by what they'd seen others do. It wasn't just the cannibalism, it was the slow unraveling of humanity, watching friends wither into skeletons, hearing the silent weeping of mothers who could no longer feed their children, choosing who to save when rescue came because there was never room for all. Communities, too, reacted differently. Some treated the survivors with pity and respect, acknowledging their suffering as heroic endurance. Others whispered and gossiped, eager to distance themselves from what had become a living nightmare etched into the American frontier myth. James Reed, to his credit, rebuilt his reputation. He served in the Mexican-American War, prospered in San Jose, and lived to an old age. But even he admitted in letters that the images of the dead, the sounds of the camp, stayed with him always. No one who survived the Donner Party returned unchanged. Whether they were 8 or 80, they had stared into the void of desperation and made choices most people pray they'll never face. And in that silence between hunger and horror, they left behind a truth few wanted to admit. Survival is not always clean. It is not always noble. Sometimes it simply means living with what you had to become. The Sierra Nevada never forgot the Donners. The lake where many of them waited out the blizzards, where they died, starved, and fed, is now known as Donner Lake, a postcard of natural beauty with a name that hums with unease. Over time, the landscape became part of the legend. Tourists came to see the site where the cabins once stood, to walk the snowy trails where the forlorn hope had trudged, to gaze at the mountains that had refused to let the pioneers pass. Locals told stories. Some whispered that the place was cursed, that the trees still remembered, that the winds carried voices. In 1918, a granite monument was erected near the lake, On top stands a solemn pioneer family, father, mother, and child, facing westward, ever hopeful. The pedestal beneath them is 22 feet tall, marking the height of the snow that winter. It's a monument to endurance, to tragedy, to the thin line between civilization and survival. But even in stone, the story remains uneasy. The monument says nothing of cannibalism, nothing of the quiet desperation, the betrayals, or the dead who were consumed to keep others alive. It's a sanitized memory, one designed for public comfort, not historical truth. Every year, school children visit the site. They hear the basic version: pioneers trapped survived, maybe a mention of starvation, rarely the rest. It's easier to honor grit than to stare into the face of what survival cost. Still, the mountains remember. The paths they took are still there, buried under ski resorts and hiking trails. The spot where Tamsin Donner stayed behind with her dying husband is now a picnic area. The frozen cabin where children wept in silence is replaced by interpretive plaques. And yet the air feels heavy, as if the ground still holds the memory of boots crunching over snow, of mothers rocking dead infants, of strangers sharing meat with trembling hands and averted eyes. Nature doesn't care. It offers no apologies. But the story persists, not just because it's horrifying, but because it's human. The Donner Party wasn't just about failure or cannibalism. It was about how far people will go to protect their families, to cling to hope, to choose life even in its most terrible form. And in the silence of the mountains, that choice still echoes. In the decades that followed, the story of the Donner Party evolved, warped by memory, distorted by gossip, and reshaped by the needs of a nation addicted to drama. The facts were gruesome enough, but that didn't stop storytellers from making them worse, or, in some cases, more heroic. Some survivors were romanticized, cast as tragic pioneers who had faced hell and returned with scars. Others, like Louis Kesselberg, became villains in the public imagination. He was accused of hoarding food, of murdering Tamsin Donner, of enjoying what he had to do to survive. None of these accusations were proven, but truth in the age of printing presses and dime novels was never the priority. The public loved extremes. They didn't want nuance. They wanted either martyrs or monsters. This made life after survival difficult. Every interview, every newspaper sketch, every fictional retelling reopened wounds. Some survivors tried to set the record straight. Virginia Reed, years later, published her own account. She begged future pioneers to avoid shortcuts and listen to those with experience. Others stayed silent, worn down by the weight of their memories and the world's fascination with them. By the late 19th century, the Donner Party had become folklore. Campfire stories told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale taught to school children, a metaphor for poor planning, for hubris, for what happens when people trust the wrong advice. The Hastings cutoff became infamous, a synonym for fatal shortcuts. And over time, the true horror of the story, the cannibalism, was used to mask the deeper tragedy, that the entire ordeal could have been prevented, that bad leadership, arrogant promises, and systemic inexperience killed more people than snow ever did. Yet there's something uniquely American in how the tale persisted. It's not just a story of failure, it's a story of obsession with movement, with reinvention, with the fantasy of taming nature and destiny. The Donner Party was a mirror, reflecting not just desperation, but the myth of westward perfection cracking under its own weight. The truth is, there were no heroes, no villains, just humans making impossible choices. And while the snow melted and time marched forward, the question never truly faded: what would you have done? Today, the Donner Party stands as more than a footnote in American history. It's a symbol, distorted, debated, and deeply uncomfortable. Unlike other tales of pioneering grit, this one refuses to sit neatly in the gallery of noble, westward expansion. It's a story that still bites. We remember the cannibalism, yes, but that was only the final act. The real legacy lies in everything that led to it: the illusion of shortcuts, the fatal power of poor leadership, the faith placed in maps drawn by dreamers instead of realists. The Donner Party exposed the fragility of the American dream when tested against the harsh indifference of nature. And yet, in that collapse, we also find something else: endurance. The survivors didn't just make it down from the mountains. They rebuilt, married, had children. Some stayed in California, others moved away to escape the whispers. A few even became quietly prosperous. Their lives weren't defined by what they had done to survive, but by the choice to keep living after it. But the cost of that survival is eternal. The site at Donner Lake still stands, preserved and somber. Visitors walk through pine trees and melting snow, reading plaques about hunger and courage. Tour guides speak in quiet tones. Historians argue over the details. Writers still can't leave the story alone. Because the Donner Party asks questions that history usually avoids. What happens when every option left is the one you swore you'd never choose? What happens when the dream of paradise turns into a snowy tomb? And if survival is all that's left, does it still matter how you achieve it? There are no satisfying answers, just echoes and bones buried beneath the snow. In the end, the Donner Party reminds us that human strength is not measured in glory, but in resolve. Not in conquest, but in the brutal, terrible choice to keep breathing, even when every comfort, law, and illusion of civilization has been stripped away. So we remember them, not just for what they did, but for what they endured. Not as legends or cautionary tales, but as people, terrified, determined, flawed, and human. And in the Sierra winds, their story still whispers through the trees, forever frozen in time, forever unfinished. Wu Zetian was not born into royalty. She was born into something far more dangerous, ambition wrapped in silk. The year was 624 CE, and the Tang Dynasty was still young, glowing with promise and poetry. Her father was a timber merchant, wealthy enough to provide his daughters with rare privileges, tutors, books, and the radical idea that a girl's mind could be just as sharp as any boy's sword. From an early age, Wu was different. While her peers learned embroidery and how to pour tea with humility, Wu studied politics, history, and literature. She was fascinated by strategy and stories of imperial rule. She didn't just read about powerful men, she imagined herself among them. By the time she turned 14, her beauty, wit, and education caught the attention of Emperor Taizong himself. She was summoned to the imperial palace and became one of the emperor's many concubines. At first glance, it might have seemed like a dead end. After all, she was ranked fairly low, a mere talented lady among dozens. But Wu had no intention of fading into the background. Even in a palace overflowing with silks and whispers, she stood out. She memorized the emperor's routines, his likes, his moods. She learned the art of silence, of knowing when to speak and when to vanish behind a curtain. But most importantly, she watched. She watched how power was wielded, and more importantly, how it was lost. And when Emperor Taizong fell ill, Wu didn't panic. She planned. Upon his death, she should have been sent to a Buddhist convent, her life effectively over. But fate, or more accurately, Wu's cunning, had other plans. She had already caught the eye of the emperor's son, Li Ji, the future Emperor Gaozong, and he hadn't forgotten her. What followed was the first in a long string of quiet revolutions. Wu wasn't just a concubine anymore. She was a student of power, and soon she'd be its master. The girl once hidden behind a palace screen would become the woman who ruled from the dragon throne. But her rise had only just begun, and the empire was not ready for what was coming. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, palace protocol dictated Wu's next step with chilling clarity. She was to be sent to a convent and live out her days, shaved-headed and silent. Most former concubines accepted this fate with quiet resignation. Wu Zetian, however, was not most. Before Taizong's death, she had already begun a subtle and dangerous entanglement with his son Li Ji, the new Emperor Gaozong. Whether it was genuine affection or ruthless calculation, their bond survived the transition of power. And so, barely a year after entering the convent, Wu returned, not as a cast-off widow, but as the emperor's secret consort. The Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, had ironically orchestrated Wu's return, hoping to distract the emperor from another rival concubine. She invited Wu back into the palace. She might as well have handed her the keys to the empire. Wu played her new role with chilling grace. She bore the emperor's sons, an advantage no rival could match. But she didn't just give him heirs, she gave him ideas. It wasn't long before she became his closest advisor, whispering thoughts that slowly rewrote the gears of state policy and court etiquette. Some said the emperor was in love, others whispered he was bewitched. Either way, she was now indispensable. Then came the blood. The rivalry with Empress Wang and another favored concubine, Consort Xiao, escalated into quiet war. In 654 CE, tragedy struck or was orchestrated. Wu's infant daughter died under suspicious circumstances. She accused Empress Wang of murder. What followed was swift and brutal. Wang and Xiao were deposed, imprisoned, and eventually mutilated. Empress Wang's limbs were hacked off and her tongue removed. Her final cries, it was said, were like those of a pig being slaughtered. Wu Zetian was now empress. Officially, this wasn't a rise, it was a coup disguised as destiny. Wu had moved from concubine to empress, not with armies but with alliances, assassinations, and the steady erosion of her enemy's influence. She didn't just survive palace life, she bent it to her will. But she wasn't finished, not even close. She had tasted power. Now she wanted the throne itself, not beside the emperor, but above it. And for the first time in China's long and patriarchal history, that unthinkable dream would start to become reality. By the late 660s, Empress Wu was no longer merely a consort who whispered advice from behind the screen. She had become the empire's silent puppeteer. Emperor Gaozong's health began to fail, his vision deteriorating, his strength waning. In his weakness, Wu found opportunity. She stepped forward as his proxy, issuing edicts in his name, presiding over court meetings, even reviewing memorials meant for the emperor's eyes only. Ministers knew the truth, but dared not say it. China was now ruled by a woman. At first, Wu ruled cautiously. She supported Buddhism over the traditional Confucian order, using its doctrines to justify her presence in politics. After all, if the Buddha had once appeared as a woman, why couldn't a woman guide the empire? It was spiritual logic with political teeth. She restructured the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit rather than family name. This was revolutionary in a court dominated by aristocratic bloodlines. To her supporters, she was a reformer. To her enemies, she was a social arsonist, setting fire to centuries of tradition. Still, Wu played the long game. She never rushed the throne. Instead, she waited, removing rivals, gathering allies, and mastering the language of statecraft. She planted informants like seeds throughout the bureaucracy. She used the imperial secret police like pruning shears. Any official who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or executed, all while she remained outwardly dutiful to the emperor. In 683, Gaozong died. The natural order should have restored male rule. Their son Zhongzong ascended the throne. But when he showed signs of independence, daring to appoint his in-laws to important positions, Wu struck. She demoted him and installed another son, Ruizong, one easier to control. Behind the throne, she ruled absolutely as Empress Dowager and Regent. It was the perfect disguise for authority, a mother protecting the empire in her son's name. But soon, even the fiction of male rule began to chafe. "Why hide anymore?" the ministers grumbled. The court scribes whispered, "China has never had a female emperor." They warned it would be unnatural. Wu listened. Then she quietly began to prepare. A new name, a new dynasty, and a new chapter in history, where the emperor wore a crown of phoenixes, not dragons. She wasn't content to rule from the shadows. She was ready to claim the light. In 690 CE, Wu Zetian finally cast aside the veil. No more proxies, no more sons sitting on the throne with her hand behind their backs. She declared the end of the Tang Dynasty and announced the birth of a new regime, the Zhou Dynasty, named after a golden age of ancient Chinese history, carefully chosen to evoke legitimacy and virtue. She was no longer Empress Dowager Wu, she was Huangdi Wu Zetian, China's first and only female emperor. The court was stunned. Some scholars recoiled in outrage, citing Confucian texts that spoke of women as obedient, modest, and confined to the inner chambers. But Wu had already rewritten the rules. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, promoted commoners who owed their rise to her, and crushed dissent before it had time to take root. To reinforce her mandate, she leaned heavily on Buddhism. Temples were built across the empire, proclaiming her as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. One monk even discovered a scripture declaring that a woman would one day rule the world and bring universal peace. Conveniently, that woman was sitting on the throne. She had portraits painted of herself seated on the throne with calm authority, and inscriptions carved in stone that praised her as a divine monarch. In a patriarchal society, it was nothing short of heresy, and yet it worked. Wu governed with a mixture of steel and silk. She strengthened the civil service exam system, ensuring that bureaucrats were chosen by ability, not birthright. She implemented agricultural reforms, lowered burdens on farmers, and increased state revenue. Under her reign, the empire remained largely stable and prosperous. But her power came with a price. She relied on a secret police network that sniffed out dissent like incense smoke in a temple. Court intrigues intensified, critics disappeared, rumors of executions, forced suicides, and torture chambers circulated like dark incense behind palace walls. Even so, she ruled with an iron grace. She wore the dragon robe. She gave imperial audiences. She issued decrees under her own name. For 15 years, Wu wasn't just the most powerful woman in China. She was the most powerful person. She had climbed every rung of a ladder she was never meant to touch, and now she stood alone at the top, ruling China as its only female emperor. Ruling China as its only female emperor brought prestige, but it also made Wu the focal point of every grudge, fear, and wounded ego in the empire. She had rewritten tradition, defied Confucian order, and outmaneuvered generations of noblemen. And that meant one thing: everyone in silk was watching her and waiting. The court seethed with quiet rebellion. Ministers who bowed by day conspired by candlelight at night. Even among her own children there was no safety. The sons she had once used as pawns began to resent her absolute control. They wanted power, but Wu had taught them too well how dangerous ambition could be. She trusted none of them. To survive, Wu didn't just govern. She played a relentless game of psychological chess. Suspected conspirators were removed under vague charges. Trials were swift, confessions often forced, and executions public. Her enemies painted her as bloodthirsty, but in truth, she was surgical. This wasn't madness, it was method. She created new ranks within the bureaucracy, titles that seemed grand but carried little power. It was her way of rewarding loyalty without handing over real control. She also elevated the status of women at court, placing female relatives and trusted concubines into positions that would have been unthinkable a generation before. Yet as the years wore on, her reliance on a few key figures began to cast shadows on her legacy. Two favorites in particular, the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Changzong, rose from court entertainers to political insiders. Handsome, charming, and decades younger, they quickly earned favor, and with it, influence. To her critics, this was scandalous. The emperor, once known for her piercing intellect and ruthless command, was now seen as a lonely woman clinging to youth through the company of fawning courtiers. Whispers of corruption and decadence began to spread. But those whispers couldn't erase her accomplishments. Under her rule, literacy expanded, civil service exams were reformed, and state infrastructure improved. She hadn't just ruled, she had governed effectively. Still, her health began to decline. Her grip on power, though still firm, was weakening. And behind her, vultures circled, eager for a return to normal, to a throne once again ruled by a man. Wu knew the end was approaching. The only question now was, would it come by illness or betrayal? By the early 700s, Wu Zetian was in her 70s, an advanced age for anyone, let alone an emperor. Her body grew frail, her strength waned, and yet her mind remained sharp, ever alert to the shifting winds of court politics. She still ruled, but now from a reclining couch behind golden screens hidden from view, and those closest to her began circling like wolves, sensing weakness. Her reliance on the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yi and Zhang Changzong, became a source of ridicule and resentment. Once charming favorites, they were now viewed as corrupt sycophants who manipulated imperial decisions for their own gain. Ministers who had long tolerated their presence began to plot. In 705 CE, the palace finally snapped. A group of senior officials and generals launched a swift coup. It wasn't bloody. It didn't need to be. The empress was surrounded, her allies captured, and the Zhang brothers were summarily executed, their heads displayed to the court as a signal. The phoenix's wings had been clipped. Faced with overwhelming pressure and deteriorating health, Wu Zetian had no choice but to abdicate. She was forced to step down and restore her son Zhongzong to the throne, the same son she had previously removed for daring to think independently. She retreated into retirement, her once vast court reduced to a small entourage. And yet, even in abdication, she retained her title as emperor and continued to exert some influence behind closed doors. China may have changed the name on its throne, but the echo of Wu Zetian's reign still lingered in every policy, every law, every shaken official afraid of another woman with ideas. She died later that same year. No grand tomb inscription, no flowery epitaph. Her name was quietly removed from official histories. The Tang dynasty erased her as thoroughly as they could, as if her reign had been a bad dream they preferred not to discuss. But history, like Wu herself, is difficult to silence. For decades afterward, poets and scholars argued about her. Was she a usurper or a visionary, a tyrant or a savior of the state, a murderer or a reformer? What is certain is this: she broke every rule the empire tried to write for her. And for 15 years, she didn't just defy history, she became it. After her death in 705 CE, the Tang dynasty moved swiftly to erase Wu Zetian's unprecedented reign. Official histories were rewritten. Her reforms were attributed to her male successors. Her name carved into records and temples was scratched out, replaced with safer, more familiar male names. Yet despite the state's efforts, Wu Zetian refused to vanish. The people remembered her. Scholars couldn't ignore her. Foreign emissaries continued to speak of the female emperor who once ruled the greatest empire on earth. And in a strange twist of fate, it was the very scholars and historians tasked with minimizing her legacy who ensured its survival. You can erase a name, but not a reign that shaped a generation. Her accomplishments were undeniable. She had elevated Buddhism to new prominence, making it a central pillar of imperial legitimacy. She had restructured the civil service, making exams more meritocratic and reducing aristocratic nepotism. She had defended the empire's borders, launched successful military campaigns, and kept internal rebellion largely in check, an achievement most male rulers could only hope for. And for women, Wu Zetian's reign was a brief, radiant constellation in a dark sky of subjugation. She appointed women to key positions, funded female education, and offered unprecedented access to the levers of power. Her rule became a mythic precedent, proof that a woman could not only survive the palace, but dominate it. Still, her legacy is tangled. Later Confucian historians painted her as a monster in makeup, a femme fatale who seduced her way to power and bathed her court in blood. Stories of her cruelty were exaggerated, her lovers multiplied, her ruthlessness elevated to near demonic proportions. It was easier to villainize her than to admit she had outperformed many of her male predecessors. But modern historians have begun to balance the scales. Today, Wu Zetian is recognized not just as a powerful woman, but as one of the most effective rulers in Chinese history, male or female. Her reign, complex and contradictory, remains a masterclass in statecraft, political survival, and ideological manipulation. She ruled in a time that said she should be silent. She conquered a system built to crush her, and in the ashes of her erasure, her name still burns, quiet, powerful, and unforgettable. To understand Wu Zetian's reign is to understand the China she shaped, not just through edicts and executions, but through culture, ideology, and identity. Her rule wasn't just a political anomaly, it was a civilizational pivot point. For one, she redefined what it meant to be imperial. Traditional emperors surrounded themselves with Confucian scholars and war generals. Wu Zetian, in contrast, built her court around Buddhist monks, scholars from humble backgrounds, and fiercely loyal officials who owed their careers to her vision of meritocracy. This fundamentally altered the power structure of the Tang dynasty. Under Wu Zetian, the civil service exams became more inclusive and rigorous. This empowered scholars from poorer, non-noble families, a dramatic shift away from the aristocratic monopolies that had dominated since the Han Dynasty. In doing so, she laid the groundwork for a more dynamic, educated bureaucracy that would endure long after her death. Culturally, she sparked a golden age of Buddhist art and architecture. Temples, pagodas, and colossal statues were erected in her name and image. At Longmen Grottoes, a massive statue of Vairocana Buddha bears unmistakable features resembling Wu herself, regal, calm, and all-seeing. These were not just religious offerings, they were political monuments, each structure whispering the same radical message: a woman could embody cosmic order. She also changed the language of rulership. Wu Zetian introduced dozens of new Chinese characters into official use, some to express abstract virtues, others designed specifically to glorify her rule. Most of these characters vanished after her reign, but the audacity of crafting a new script to describe a new regime speaks volumes about her vision. Perhaps most revolutionary was her manipulation of gender roles. By portraying herself as both mother and sovereign, she fused the intimate and the imperial. She didn't challenge masculinity directly, she absorbed it into her persona. She was at once the nurturing protector and the ruthless enforcer, the dragon and the phoenix, the emperor and the empress. Her empire was not perfect, dissent was punished harshly, trust was a rare currency. But it functioned, evolved, and expanded under her, and that, despite centuries of resistance to her legacy, cannot be denied. Wu Zetian didn't just rule the Tang dynasty, she remodeled it. Wu Zetian died over 1,300 years ago, and yet the echo of her reign still ripples through China's cultural memory, a haunting melody of brilliance, brutality, and bold defiance. While her name was once scraped from stone and banished from official annals, time has a way of unearthing what history tries to bury. In the centuries that followed, she became a paradox in popular folklore. She was portrayed as everything from a cruel seductress to a divine ruler. Opera troupes dramatized her life, sometimes portraying her as a tragic heroine, sometimes as a ruthless tyrant. She was demonized, sanctified, misunderstood, and yet never forgotten. No woman in Chinese history has ever matched her climb or her crown. Others held power as dowagers or regents, but none ever declared themselves emperor. None dared to remake dynasties, rewrite language, or stand alone atop the world's most powerful throne. And the legacy of that fact, that she broke the unbreakable rule, continues to inspire debate. To some, she remains a cautionary tale, the danger of ambition unbound, of femininity in armor. But to others, especially modern historians, feminists, and political thinkers, she is something else entirely, a symbol of resilience, a case study in raw political genius, a monument to the cost and consequence of leading when you were never meant to. Even today, Wu Zetian is more than a historical figure. She's a mirror. In her rise, you see the gears of systemic injustice turning, and in her reign, the moment they were jammed. She didn't just defy expectations, she obliterated them. And yet she also paid the price of greatness. Her legacy remains clouded by moral ambiguity. She used fear as much as fairness. Her enemies died not just in disgrace, but sometimes without trial, their voices lost to history. Her compassion was selective, her justice strategic. She was not a saint, but she was never trying to be. Wu Zetian ruled not to be liked, but to survive, and in surviving, she made history. And so she remains, the woman emperor who rose from the shadows of concubinage, who walked into a world that said no and answered with a throne. In a land of dragons, she crowned herself the phoenix, and in that flame she burned her name into eternity. In the ancient world, a road wasn't just a convenience, it was a declaration of power. The moment a ruler ordered a road to be carved through forest, desert, or mountain, it wasn't about ease of travel, it was about control. Roads were empire in motion. Unlike rivers or oceans, which nature dictated, roads were human impositions. They cut through geography, tethered distant outposts to capitals, and reminded everyone, from merchant to rebel, that civilization had reach. A good road meant troops could move fast, taxes could be collected efficiently, and goods from the frontier could be brought to the heart of the empire. The earliest known roads go back to Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. These weren't paved highways, but compacted dirt paths used for carts and trade caravans. Even then, societies realized something crucial. When people move, ideas, goods, and influence move with them, and whoever builds the path controls the flow. In ancient Persia, the royal road stretched over 1,600 miles from Sardis to Susa. It had way stations, rest areas, and royal couriers who could gallop across the empire in record time. Herodotus claimed a message could travel its full length in just 7 days, unheard of for the time. That speed wasn't just impressive, it was intimidating. It meant that the king's voice could reach every corner of the empire in days, not weeks. But it was the Romans who perfected the road as an imperial instrument. They built over 50,000 miles of stone-paved roads across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, straight, durable, and astonishingly well-engineered. These roads were designed not for beauty, but for efficiency. Marching legions, grain shipments, imperial messengers, each depended on that stone beneath their feet. Roman roads often started with military purposes in mind, but their civilian impact was just as transformative. Farmers could get their goods to markets, Travelers could cross regions in safety. Cities became linked not just by politics, but by stone and sweat. In every civilization that mattered, the road was never just about transportation, it was about transformation. Because to build a road was to reshape the land, and with it, reshape the power that ruled it. If the ancient world had an engineering superpower, it was Rome. And their greatest tool wasn't just the aqueduct or the arch, it was the road. Roman roads weren't just pathways, they were the bones of an empire. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't metaphorical, it was logistical. The Romans built over 50,000 miles of roads, stone-laid, expertly drained, and arrow-straight. They connected Britain to Egypt, the Rhine to the Danube, and every strategic military outpost in between. These roads made the empire feel smaller, faster, and more manageable. Roman engineers followed a formula. First, they chose a route, not necessarily the easiest, but often the straightest. Then came surveying, using tools like the groma for right angles and distance. Once the path was set, they began excavation. A Roman road was built in layers, like a cake of conquest. The bottom layer, stadamen, was made of large stones. Above that came rudis, a mix of crushed stone and lime. Next was nucleus, a layer of compacted sand or gravel. Finally, the summa crusta, a paved top of interlocking stone slabs, often crowned in the center for water runoff. The result was a road that could withstand centuries of weather, hooves, and sandals. Some are still in use today. But engineering was only half the story. Roman roads came with infrastructure. Mile markers, rest stops, and way stations called mansiones, where officials and messengers could rest and resupply. The cursus publicus, Rome's courier system, used these roads to move messages across the empire at astonishing speed, nearly 50 miles a day in some cases. And the roads moved more than mail, they moved legions. A rebellion in Gaul, a skirmish in Judea, Roman troops could march hundreds of miles faster than any enemy expected. Roads became an extension of Rome's military muscle, silent, solid, and always advancing. But with soldiers came settlers, and with settlers came cities. Roads encouraged trade, migration, and the spread of Roman law, language, and architecture. They were arteries, pumping culture as well as conquest. For Rome, a road wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, a symbol, a message carved in stone that said Rome is here. And wherever Rome built, the world changed beneath their feet. While Rome built roads in stone, the Inca Empire built them in the sky. Stretching over 25,000 miles, the Capacñan, the great Inca road system, was a marvel of Andean engineering. It tied together one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth, connecting deserts, jungles, and mountains that soared past 13,000 feet. And the Inca did it all without the wheel, without draft animals, beyond the llama, and without metal tools in the European sense. This wasn't just a road system, it was the spine of an empire. At the heart of it all was Cusco, the Inca capital. Radiating out like spokes on a sunwheel, the roads linked provincial centers, military outposts, agricultural hubs, and sacred sites. The most famous stretch is the Inca Trail, which winds its way to Machu Picchu, but that was just one thread in a vast imperial web. The roads varied in size and construction. In the lowlands, they were wide and paved with stone. In the high mountains, they were narrow paths cut into cliffs, sometimes no more than a foot wide. Where rivers ran, the Inca built rope suspension bridges, using woven grasses strong enough to support travelers and caravans of llamas. These bridges had to be remade yearly, a community ritual that still survives in parts of Peru today. There were no wheeled carts, all transport was by foot or by llama. But the Incas had something even more efficient, chasqui relay runners. These messengers sprinted between tambos, or rest stations, built every few miles. Messages, food, and even fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor in Cusco within days. This system allowed the empire to function with astonishing speed despite having no written script. But the roads were also spiritual. Many followed Sika lines, sacred lines that radiated from Cusco to shrines and mountains. Travel wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Each step reinforced imperial order and religious harmony. The Capacñan wasn't a Roman-style conquest machine. It was a tether, a way to hold a vertical empire together. From snow-capped peaks to coastal deserts, the roads made unity possible. And though much of it is gone today, some stretches still endure. Stones fitted without mortar still carrying footsteps after 500 years. The Inca didn't just conquer the Andes, they stitched it together one path at a time. Centuries before Rome, and far from the Andean peaks, another empire stitched together its vast territory with stone and strategy, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And at its heart ran the Royal Road, a 1,500-mile engineering triumph stretching from Sardis in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the Persian capitals. Commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, the Royal Road wasn't just a way to move goods. It was a political artery, a demonstration of imperial sophistication, and one of the earliest true long-distance highways in recorded history. The Persians didn't invent roads, but they standardized them, militarized them, and made them the foundation of bureaucracy. Their engineers scouted routes that balanced terrain with directness, avoiding swamps and scaling mountains when necessary. The result was a surprisingly smooth and fast connection across a continent-spanning empire. Herodotus wrote that royal messengers could cross the entire Royal Road in 7 days, a journey that would have taken a regular traveler about 90 days. How? The system of relay stations. Every 15 to 18 miles, there were posting stations with fresh horses and supplies. Couriers would switch horses and continue riding at top speed, a system that prefigured the Pony Express by over 2,000 years. But these roads weren't only for messengers. Merchants, military units, diplomats, and tax collectors used them constantly. The Royal Road helped knit together a multi-ethnic empire that included Greeks, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and more. It made possible something extraordinary in the ancient world: central oversight of distant provinces. Road guards ensured safety, and caravanserais provided shelter and provisions. The entire system relied on maintenance and order, two things the Persian bureaucracy excelled at. Road crews were deployed to fix damage, and tolls were sometimes collected at river crossings or mountain passes. The Persians also pioneered road markers and milestones, tools for measuring distance and ensuring consistency across regions. These practices would echo later in Rome and Byzantium. The Royal Road didn't survive the fall of Persia intact, but its influence lingered. Alexander the Great used it to invade the empire, and the Romans later expanded upon the concept. Even today, modern highways follow parts of its ancient route. It proved one powerful idea: an empire isn't ruled by sword alone. It's ruled by the speed of a message and the strength of the road it travels. While the Romans were laying stone in Europe and the Incas were carving trails through the Andes, another empire was quietly building a road network that would shape the world in a different way: Han Dynasty China. Their roads didn't just connect cities. They stitched together a civilization and fueled the rise of one of the most legendary trade systems in human history: the Silk Road. Under the Han Dynasty, especially during the reign of Emperor Wu, 141 to 87 BCE, roads became a tool for expansion and control. The government poured resources into constructing and maintaining long-distance routes that extended from the imperial capital of Chang'an into Central Asia. These roads weren't just for merchants. They were vital military and administrative arteries. Unlike Roman roads, Han roads weren't uniformly stone-paved. Many were hard-packed dirt or gravel, occasionally reinforced with planks in muddy regions or stone slabs in high-traffic areas. But what they lacked in uniform engineering, they made up for in scale and organization. The postal relay system, known as the Yichan, was remarkably advanced. Stations were placed at regular intervals, complete with fresh horses and accommodations for government messengers. This allowed imperial decrees and tax records to travel across thousands of miles with surprising speed. These roads supported not just governance, but diplomacy and trade. Envoys like Zhang Qian, who journeyed westward into Central Asia, opened up contact with cultures as far as Persia and India. Silk, jade, paper, and spices flowed outward. In return, China received horses, glassware, and new agricultural ideas. Security was essential. The Han invested heavily in maintaining military garrisons along the routes, especially near the Hexi Corridor, a narrow, windswept strip of land that acted as a gateway between China and the West. Watchtowers, beacon mounds, and walled settlements dotted the road, creating a lattice of imperial presence. Culturally, the road system enabled the spread of Confucianism, Buddhism, and administrative practices across diverse regions. Travelers, monks, soldiers, and merchants moved ideas along with goods, shaping a unified identity that would last long beyond the Han. Han roads weren't built to impress, they were built to endure. And while many vanished beneath later cities or were reclaimed by dust and desert, their legacy remained, because through these roads, China didn't just defend its borders, it opened a door to the world. The ancient Greeks are rarely celebrated for their roads. They didn't build grand highways like the Romans or stretch vast networks like the Persians. But what they did build, though more modest in scale, reveals how roads could shape not only commerce and war, but culture, religion, and identity. Greece's rugged, mountainous terrain made road building difficult and expensive. So instead of imperial highways, the Greeks developed a patchwork of stone-paved local routes, often connecting city-states rather than unifying a vast empire. These roads followed natural terrain and were typically narrow, just wide enough for pack animals or chariots. Yet despite their simplicity, they played a crucial role in the Greek world. One of the most famous routes was the Sacred Way from Athens to Eleusis, used during the Eleusinian Mysteries, religious festivals dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Each year, thousands of initiates walked this road in a grand procession, chanting hymns and carrying offerings. For them, the road was not just a path, it was a rite of passage, a journey from the world of the living into mystery and transformation. Another iconic route was the Panhellenic Road leading to Delphi, the home of the Oracle of Apollo. Pilgrims, kings, and philosophers alike took this winding road through mountains and valleys to consult the oracle. Along the way were treasuries, shrines, and inscribed stones, forming a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. But Greek roads weren't only sacred. They were used by soldiers, philosophers, and traders. Think of Xenophon's Anabasis, describing the long retreat of Greek mercenaries through Persia, a brutal, road-bound odyssey. Or imagine Socrates, who often walked from the agora to the academy or the lyceum to teach under the open sky, his feet tracing worn paths of dialogue and debate. What set Greek roads apart wasn't their engineering, it was their integration into daily life. They weren't built by emperors to display dominance, they emerged organically, shaped by marketplaces, sanctuaries, and social rituals. And through them, ideas traveled just as fast as soldiers or carts. Philosophy, theater, democracy, even Olympic athletes, they all moved on dusty, narrow roads that wound through olive groves and city gates. Simple as they were, Greek roads carried the weight of a civilization that changed the world not by force, but by thought. In ancient India, roads weren't just channels of commerce. They were arteries of spiritual life, imperial governance, and cultural exchange. From the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BCE to later Gupta rule, Indian civilizations developed a remarkably organized road network that connected fertile river valleys, coastal ports, trade towns, and holy cities. The most transformative period for ancient Indian roads came under Emperor Ashoka, the Buddhist monarch who ruled most of the subcontinent around 268 to 232 BCE. After renouncing violence following the bloody Kalinga War, Ashoka turned to public welfare, and roads became a central feature of that transformation. Ashoka ordered the construction and expansion of roads across his empire. These weren't just dirt paths, they were deliberately engineered routes, often lined with trees for shade, wells for water, and rest houses for travelers. He placed inscribed stone pillars along the roads, not to mark distances, but to declare edicts urging compassion, truthfulness, and religious tolerance. It was governance by visibility. The most famous of these roads ran from Pataliputra, modern-day Patna, to the northwest frontier, connecting the Ganges Plain to present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. This stretch later became part of the northern trade route that would evolve into the Silk Road, linking India to China, Persia, and the Greco-Roman world. Indian roads carried more than goods. They carried faiths and philosophies. Buddhist monks walked these roads to spread their teachings. Hindu pilgrims used them to journey between sacred rivers and temples. Even Jain sages took to these routes in quiet contemplation. The roads became bridges between ideas. Trade flourished. From the eastern coast, goods like spices, textiles, ivory, and gems traveled inland and outward, reaching Roman ports and Central Asian markets. Roads linked urban centers like Taxila, Ujjain, and Varanasi, each a hub of commerce and scholarship. Though many Indian roads were not paved like Roman ones, they were maintained seasonally, especially before monsoon rains. Engineers used gravel, wood planks, and packed earth, often elevated slightly to prevent flooding. What made India's ancient road system unique wasn't brute force. It was plurality. Roads served kings, farmers, saints, and scholars alike. They didn't just connect empires, they connected worldviews. And in that blend of purpose, part political, part spiritual, part economic, India paved not just roads, but pathways to influence that would stretch far beyond its borders. Ancient roads weren't just flat paths stretching across the land. They were feats of engineering that overcame rivers, ravines, and rugged terrain. To build effective roads, civilizations had to master the art of bridge building, drainage, and durable construction. The Romans were pioneers in bridge engineering. Their roads often crossed vast rivers using stone arch bridges, structures that could support heavy loads and endure centuries. The Ponte Fabricio in Rome and the Alcantara Bridge in Spain are prime examples. The Roman arch, using keystones and carefully cut stones, distributed weight perfectly. Their bridges weren't just practical, they were symbols of imperial power, inviting awe and respect. But the Romans weren't alone. The Inca, faced with wild rivers cutting through Andean gorges, built rope suspension bridges crafted from woven grasses and vines. These bridges were lightweight but incredibly strong, rebuilt annually by local communities in rituals still practiced today. Crossing these bridges was not just a physical challenge, but a cultural one, binding communities to the land and to each other. In ancient China, engineers developed beam bridges and pontoon bridges. The famous Zhaozhou Bridge, built during the Sui Dynasty, completed in 605 CE, is the world's oldest open spandrel stone segmental arch bridge. It combined aesthetic grace with remarkable engineering, allowing heavy traffic to cross the Jiaohe River for centuries. Drainage was equally critical. Roman roads were crowned in the center to shed rainwater quickly, with ditches on either side. In the wet and monsoon-prone lands of India and Southeast Asia, roads were often elevated on causeways or filled with gravel layers to prevent washouts. Some empires even built roads with multiple layers of materials, compacted soil, stones, gravel, and paving slabs to ensure durability. Beyond bridges and drainage, the creation of way stations and mile markers along ancient roads provided travelers with rest, supplies, and orientation, early versions of highway rest stops. These engineering achievements didn't just facilitate movement, they shaped economies, warfare, and culture. A bridge could mean the difference between an army crossing into enemy lands or being stopped cold. A well-maintained road could mean the survival of a city through trade and communication. Ultimately, the engineering behind ancient roads was an expression of human ingenuity, a testament to how societies adapted to and reshaped their environments to move people, goods, and ideas across vast landscapes. Throughout history, ancient roads were more than mere pathways. They were the lifelines that allowed empires to thrive, expand, and endure. Roads connected distant cities and remote villages, enabling trade, communication, and cultural exchange that defined civilizations. Empires understood that without efficient roads, armies could not move quickly, governors could not enforce law, and merchants could not prosper. Roads shaped economic hubs, encouraged urban growth, and even influenced the spread of religions and philosophies. The Silk Road, the Roman Via Appia, the Inca Capac Ñan, all carried more than just goods. They carried ideas and identities. The maintenance of these roads required vast bureaucracies and dedicated labor forces, reflecting the organizational prowess of empires like Rome, Persia, China, and the Incas. Roads became a measure of an empire's reach and stability. When roads were kept in good repair, empires flourished. When neglected, regions drifted into isolation, rebellion, or decline. But roads also symbolize human ambition, the desire to connect, control, and communicate across vast spaces. They show how early engineers and leaders understood geography not just as a barrier, but as a canvas to reshape. Today, many ancient roads lie beneath modern highways, while others remain as archaeological treasures. They remind us that the infrastructure we often take for granted was once a monumental achievement, paved with sweat, stone, wood, and ingenuity. The legacy of ancient roads is alive in every journey we take, every letter sent, and every trade route that links our globalized world. They are the silent architects of empire, culture, and civilization. In essence, the story of ancient roads is the story of humanity itself, ever on the move, building bridges, both literal and metaphorical, across time and space.